Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst the news items we have for you this week, a mouse model that challenges the current theories on the cause of Alzheimer's disease, the increasing prevalence of flesh-eating bacteria in the USA, how Oxford was surprisingly the murder capital of medieval England, and much as today it is all down to students. The increasing expansion of cropland across the world, a missing nuclear bomb, and finally, the ISRIS Rex lander brings back samples of an asteroid. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting with Alzheimer's disease, it is one of the more nasty, if not insidious, neurological diseases out there. It slowly breaks down the brain's ability to function, and your mind and just everything goes. There's no way to really stop it. All you can do is hope to slow it down with treatment. This is why understanding the causality of it is essential. Our current theories are simply that tau proteins build up along with alpha amyloid plaques, and these interfere with neurological activity. How these occur isn't exactly well established, but that's the general idea. The new model focuses on a gene rather than the tau proteins or amyloid plaques. This is where things get, difficult, let's say. It relies heavily on a single protein called GluA2, which is a glutamine A2 receptor. This is part of the neuron, and it's effectively a means of communicating between neurons. It receives the necessary signals or neurotransmitters from other neurons, and then it acts on that, and without these working, neurons neither receive nor continue to transmit any neurological messages that occur. The theory behind this is that if you edit the RNA, you can therefore edit the ability for these receptors to be interfered with. Fundamentally the same idea behind the COVID-19 vaccines. That is, by having messenger RNA converted into protein, you can, to a certain extent, control or modulate the activity of these receptors, and therefore make them more functional, or at least function somewhat again. Of course, the ever-prevalent caveat applies to this. It is a mouse model, and therefore the probability of it turning out to be true in humans is, incredibly slim, and anybody thinking that this is definitive evidence of anything is incredibly optimistic. Next we have the weird relationship between zebra stripes and sperm tails, or at least so claim mathematicians. If you look at zebrafish through to zebras themselves, you'll find that these sorts of striping patterns occur throughout the world, and this is where mathematicians think that they may have at least some idea as to what's happening. This is where things get difficult, let's say. Before we get into the mathematicians' findings, let's explain what's actually happening. The entire theory, let's say, is based on Alan Turing's work into, exactly this sort of phenomena. That is, the development of stripes. Turing described what is called a reaction-diffusion system. That is, when two molecules diffuse across space. Ideally, this should prevent you from having the same molecules in the same location, creating two distinct clusters, let's say. But when you have multiple events like this, you find that you begin to have each of them come together in one location. So white stripes come together to become white stripes, and black stripes become together to form black stripes. This leads us to the development of a sperm tail, and particularly its movement. The mathematicians believe that the movement of molecules within the base of a sperm tail is what allows it to move, and that this diffusion and movement of the molecules is exactly the same phenomena as you would see with, zebra stripes. The same basic idea, a reaction-diffusion model. The caveat to this research is, rather obvious. That is, they've created a model and then tried to see if there are species that exhibit the same behavior. And yes, they were successful, but the reality is that the basics of the flagellum in particular, but also the sperm tail, are incredibly complex, comprising hundreds if not thousands of different proteins all working together to achieve the result in question. So this is not likely to be just as simple as a reaction to fusion scenario. Moving on to other microbiological news, we have flesh-eating bacteria, and the fact that there is an ever-increasing number of them in the USA, and to a certain extent, according to the conversation, just how you can avoid them. Although avoiding them may be a overly optimistic analysis. Generally speaking, there are a small number of bacteria that are particularly known to cause necrotizing fasciitis, the technical name for flesh-eating diseases. The most common is going to be something like staph or strep. These are something that can be treated with current medication, and although, yes, we are increasingly relying on the more extreme antibiotics, we can still treat it. The issue is the less well-known, or let's say less common bacteria, something like Vibrio vulnificus. These are more of a difficulty because, well, treating them is harder. We don't necessarily have antibiotics developed for them. The issue then leads to how do you get infected in the first place, and for the most part, it's swimming in seawater. Generally speaking, warm seawater. But it's not enough to simply swim in the ocean when it's warm. You need to be swimming in what is called brackish water. This is water that's seawater and fresh water mixing together, so areas where there are bays, estuaries, and similar. The challenge with this is not so much that you're going to get infected, particularly since many people don't necessarily live in areas where they're able to swim in such comfortable waters. The problem is, at least arguably, that of climate change. As ocean levels rise, but also temperatures as well, you get more places exposed to warm waters that mix with fresh water. The fresh water mixing with seawater leads to the perfect environment for things like Vibrio vulnificus. The challenge here then is, well, protecting yourself, and the reality is, well, don't swim when you have open wounds, new piercings, or tattoos. If you are going to swim, use a waterproof bandage. There's not really any particularly stunning solutions here. There are several other means by which you can become infected and other issues related to it, but we'll leave those to the article below to explain in greater detail. You'll find a link in the description box. Shifting from microbiology and medical news to what is arguably a pure medical news, but something of a satirical award. It is the Rusty Razor Award, this year awarded to Dr Aseem Malhotra for, well, being effectively an anti-vaxxer. This individual is well known for their criticism of things like the COVID-19 vaccines, but also for promoting a variety of other ridiculous ideas. The ridiculous claims they've made, both on Twitter and elsewhere, are why they've received this satirical award. Some of the highlights, let's say, include their 21-day immunity plan, which included a diet which is said to improve the immune system and help fight off infections. Something that, well, is bullshit. Yes, diet will contribute to your immune system. You need certain vitamins, minerals, and so on to have a good immune system, but they will not improve the functionality of it in 21 days. As we previously pointed out with vitamin C videos, you need to start taking them at least 6 months before you're going to get infected to have any real benefit, and that assumes that your diet is already deficient in things like vitamin C. If that's not the case, you gain nothing from it. If you're at a loss as to why it's called the Rusty Razor, it's a play on Occam's razor. Occam's razor basically says that the simplest explanation is generally correct. In this case, by failing to apply the idea of the simplest explanation correctly, it's like having a rusty tool. It really doesn't work in all cases. Yes, you can generally attribute a simple explanation to resolve something, but at the same time, you may also be completely wrong. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. That is a simple explanation for light. But if you're inside, you now need to start finding more complex explanations, and this is where Occam's razor begins to fall apart. Shifting to news that's more historical, we need to talk about Oxford, and, well, Oxford has historically been a, centre of learning and education. Unfortunately, this also means many students. In the medieval period, these students were also one of the biggest causes of problems, and as a result, surprisingly, executions. The research found that, Oxford had a rate of executions 4 to 5 times that of high population areas, for example, London. And the reason is that about 75% of the individuals who were executed for murder were noted as being clericus, a term associated with students or members of the University of Oxford. Weirdly, 72% of the victims were also classified the same way, so it would appear that it was student-on-student violence. Extreme violence at that. The rationale for this finding is, not that different from today. It's a bunch of young men with access to weapons, alcohol, and, opportunities to delve into depravity, and so they tended to find themselves in situations that they took high risks and gambled, and in many cases lost. This also was losing in perhaps the worst way possible. The numbers themselves might not mean all that much. After all, 75% is not that particularly impressive if you just think, oh, it's the medieval time, there weren't that many people. But if you were to translate this per capita, it's somewhere between 60 and 75 people per 100,000. England's current murder rate is about 20 per million. So if we multiply the medieval rate, we're talking between somewhere around 600 to 750 people per million in England at the time. That's somewhere between 30 and 35 times the rate of murder today. Examples of the ridiculous murder rates include a servant who was murdered because his master was urinating on the street. Another because he wasn't allowed to join a group who were singing and dancing on the streets in the early hours of the morning. Yeah, this is not so different to university groups today if you go out on a university night and watch some of their shenanigans. Next we have a super slippery toilet that will be installed in all political buildings, no doubt so that nothing sticks to the politicians. Wait, that's to the toilets. Generally speaking, the vast majority of toilets today are made out of some kind of porcelain or ceramic. This is because the material that covers them once they've been enameled is very slippery, or at least relatively so. It is a proven technology that's lasted over a century. As anybody who's ever dealt with teenagers or gone to a public bathroom would know, the technology definitely does not last and definitely is not perfect, and often will find themselves disgusted at what they see. The technology is, fairly straightforward in the concept, it's the execution that is hard. The basic mixture is that of plastic and hydrophobic sand grains. The hydrophobic element means that it effectively repels water. This allows the water to get between whatever is on the surface and the toilet bowl itself, thereby more effectively dislodging it. The reason they used both plastic and hydrophobic sand grains is that it's actually something they can sinter or shine a very powerful laser on and melt together. The researchers do claim that even after abrading it with sandpaper for what they call 1000 cycles, it remains non-adhesive, or super slippery as they also call it. The question there is, how do they define sandpaper and exactly what grit was used? After all, if you take something like 60 or 80 grit sandpaper to this, it's much likely that it's going to, be very easily adhered to, versus using something like 8,000 or 10,000 grit sandpaper that probably won't even be noticed. The importance of, updating the porcelain throne are maybe not obvious, and it really does come down to a simple concept. A lot of water is used in flushing toilets. Now, you could use the squatty potty instead, but this is not really common in a lot of countries. As a result, the, let's say, update to the toilet is kind of useful, especially since it's a relatively simple change. We're not looking at a massive overhaul to the nature of toilets. Rather, you can simply use a standard toilet design and then add what is practically a liner to it. Next, we build on this idea of environment and sustainability with the global map of cropland or agricultural land and how it's changed. Notably, how the amount of cropland growth has accelerated extensively in the last 20 or so years. In the last, 20 years, the amount of area has increased by somewhere between 9 and 25%. The majority of this growth has been in Africa and South America, whereas in other areas the growth has been significantly less. The concern here is, given that most of this new cropland has been, made available by either cutting down forested areas or other natural vegetation, this means that the new cropland is arguably not sustainable, particularly if you want to try and maintain ecosystems. The other issue is that, conversely to the increase in cropland for those countries, the actual amount of cropland needed for the population has decreased by 10%. This means we now need less land as a result of improvements in agricultural techniques and technologies elsewhere. For example, genetically modified food. This may also explain why, at least in some countries, it's closer to either a negative decrease or a actual negative decrease in the size of land being used. For example, in Southeast Asia, there has been a relative stationary change. If not a stationary change, certainly the amount of food being generated has remained on the climb or increase, while the amount of land used hasn't, which means the land is being used more effectively. Places like, say, Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, and North and Central America are perfect examples of this. This is a phenomenon we've touched on before when we had a video on the effectiveness and sustainability of various diets, including being a vegan, pescatarian, vegetarian, or omnivore. Shifting to somewhat older news, but something that was brought to our attention recently, sex robots. But the dangers of sex robots. And whilst yes, it is true that Futurama did highlight the concerns of this earlier, their concerns are slightly different to what we've found to be in reality. That is, rather than humans becoming overly attached to their sex robot, this sex robot is instead prone to violence and could possibly kill the humans that are associated with them to satisfy our YouTube overlords. The issue comes down to coding and how they're coded to respond to certain things. The most obvious would be that, if they either have a free will, given the nature of what they're there for, they may not be exactly happy about it. The second possibility is that, if they can't process the nature of what they're doing and certainly the consequences, they may engage in certain actions that lead to very negative consequences. Being embraced by the robot may actually be the final thing you ever experience, as they slowly crush you to death, or squish you so hard that you're unable to breathe and effectively suffocate in their arms. Of course, humanity doesn't really need to worry about the robots killing us. We're likely to do this ourselves, as we've already lost a surprisingly large number of nuclear weapons. And these are only the nuclear weapons that the American government, by virtue of, some degree of transparency, has made us aware of. This doesn't tell us anything about, say, the former Soviet Union's lost nuclear weapons, those from France or the UK, and so on. This leads us to the uncomfortable reality of America's west coast, and particularly around Georgia. Every now and then, there is a signal that indicates radioactivity off the coast, and when this happens, America goes searching for a nuclear bomb that was lost in 1958. Yeah. There are a few, at least, optimistic caveats to this event. One, that although it was common practice for aircraft at the time to carry bombs when they were practicing the inevitable reality of nuclear destruction, they didn't arm the bombs. This means that yes, there was a warhead on board, but the actual bomb itself was not armed to detonate. It doesn't mean it can't detonate, only that it probably won't detonate. This is why, despite dropping the bomb itself, well, it didn't blow up, which would have been something we're all well aware of now, although perhaps not as well versed in as places like Bikini Atoll. The biggest irony about all of this is that it might actually be more dangerous to try and retrieve and remove this nuclear weapon sitting off the coast of Georgia. That's because in doing so, they may inadvertently detonate it, and this would create exactly the issue they're trying to avoid. The problems of it remaining where and how it is include things like heavy metal toxicity, as the bomb slowly breaks down over time, although even if it does degrade, the probability of it detonating is incredibly tiny. This again comes down to the fact that it isn't necessarily armed and likely won't be, despite being sunk in the ocean. There's no way for the necessary components to come into contact in the right way. Given that humanity is trying to destroy itself either with robots or missing nuclear weapons, you might think that there's somewhere you can go to get some peace and quiet and optimistically hope that humanity will survive. For example, the moon. And this may be what's behind China's plan to build, well, bases in moon caves. Or the alternative is that they think that the moon has been part of China's territory since ancient times, and that West Taiwan just wants to move into their own territory that they own, much like the 9-dash line. This is where the idea has some merit, not the reclaiming of long-lost territory, rather there is an actual pragmatic means by which they could execute this. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has found that there are a large number of what are called skylights, or lunar skylights more accurately. And these are places where lava tubes have broken open, revealing means of accessing these incredibly long tunnels, and in some cases incredibly large tunnels at hundreds of meters in diameter. These would be ideal situations to create temporary, if not permanent, moon bases. The reason you need a cave basically, is that humanity on the moon would be exposed to a lot more issues than we would on Earth. There is no atmosphere to protect us from things like radiation. As a result, you need to rely heavily on the sheer bulk of the moon and its surface to do the same thing that the atmosphere on Earth does. And so by moving into tunnels, you would be able to, have that protection without having to build or dig your own. And just like cave humans, or cavemen, did exactly the same thing to hide from the elements on Earth, we would be hiding from the elements in space. While the idea of West Taiwan colonizing the moon is slightly disconcerting, it's also at least somewhat optimistic. They intend to at least get a moon base started by somewhere around 2028, and to have a manned lunar landing by 2030. The theory we have with this is that they're likely to try and get some sort of facilities established in 2028. These will support robotic services, effectively rovers, drones, and similar. Vehicles that can explore these caves and figure out where to set up a moon base, what would be needed, and importantly, how viable certain technology as we have it now is. From that, in the next 2 years, China would look to, get people there to start setting up what they need in person, or in space. The other issue, though, is that, if they're going to power this, how are they going to power it? And we're hoping that they're not going to lose a nuclear reactor or weapon on the moon. The final news item we have for you this week is the return of NASA's ISRIS Rex lander and the samples of an asteroid that is brought back to Earth. The asteroid samples came from Bennu, and this is a asteroid from 4 billion miles away, or using more civilized numbers, it's something along the lines of 6.2 billion kilometers. It then had to travel the same distance back to Earth. And just consider how difficult it is to throw a dart shoot a rifle or even throw a ball and accurately hit something reliably, and that's only a relatively short distance, let alone trying to do that over billions of kilometers. Yeah, not only did humanity get the craft there, but was able to return it to Earth with samples and recover them intact. Although it's not a lot of material. It's only 250 grams, which is about 9 freedom units, or roughly 9 ounces. If you feel a need for speed, you might be either horrified or pleased to know just how fast the craft had to travel. It was travelling at about 44,000 kilometers an hour. This is about 27,000 freedom units. It got to temperatures somewhere around 3,000 degrees Celsius or 5,300 freedom units. The division of the spoils from this are interesting to say the least. They're going to be splitting it several ways. The first is that NASA keeps 70% of the sample. 25% will be divided over about 200 scientists in 35 different facilities. Then you have 4% sent to Canada, and then 0.5% given to Japan's Aerospace Exploration Agency. So this does leave 0.5% unexplained, but possibly rounding errors. The reason that they're likely to be so generous as to explicitly give Japan a particular amount is due to, well, Japan's previous achievements in doing exactly the same thing with Hayabusa 1 and Hayabusa 2, which both successfully returned samples from Ryugu and Itokawa. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.